So these lines seem important to the process and the spirit of Hong's work. So whoever you are, in the evening step out of your room where you know everything. Yours is the last house before the far off, whoever you are. And it goes on from there, the text here on the wall. But Hong, maybe you can say something about your process and the relationship between that stepping out into the unknown and the way this work has gone into the interior and from the exterior inside and from the inside outside again.
Okay, yeah, I can talk a little bit about the interior versus the exterior. I've been reading Lauren Isley recently, and in it, he compares the survival of humanity to a battle between the inside and the outside. So one way that we are all sitting here today has been because our bodies have, through evolution, been able to maintain that few degrees of temperature, even within a situation where we're exposed to extreme temperatures. And it's interesting to me that our bodies are constructed with cells which have a wall or a barrier, and certain things are allowed to pass through, whereas other things are not. So a lot of my work begins in my studio. Well, actually, it begins outside as trees, and that bark is harvested. It then travels across the sea to my studio, where I process the bark by hand through this very ritualistic process of cooking the fiber, beating the fiber, dyeing the fiber. And sometimes I feel like I'm sitting in my own cell where a lot of different chemical reactions are happening and different forms are conversing with one another. It's sort of this self-sustained complex system. And then the raw materials that I create are then taken outside, where it's shaped by the elements as it sits on top of a modular mold. And what's really beautiful to me is that these objects have the chance to see the sunrise and the moon set the same way that we can. It's not really a painting that is begun in a studio and then is shut up in a box and travels into a gallery. It's the idea that they live a life of their own in an exterior, and that there's a movement or a sense of travel between the two, energetically and physically.
So that reminds me of something that you said in one of our email exchanges that I thought was so beautiful. I was asking Hong about the role that the body plays in her work, both her own body making these, making the paper, and the sort of athleticism of making and pounding and pouring, and also the sort of bodily aspect of these enormous amorphous shapes that change and take shape differently. And so I asked her at this, and she wrote back to me, I hope you don't mind if I just read this little snippet, but she wrote back to me, "I'm not interested in art objects. Instead, tell me about the life that surrounds them." And so we then started having this conversation about bodies and how to think about bodies. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that and the way that the kind of thinking about the body as a life surrounding things.
Of course. Yeah. When Megan and I first met, she said something that was incredibly moving to me. And I think later in our slideshow, you'll see a quote, but it's, and I could be misquoting him, but it's from Aristotle, who compared one's soul to wax. And you had mentioned this. Mm-hmm. And it was a material capable of holding the shallow imprints and deep impressions of all that we experience. I think this phenomenon is echoed in our bodies as we deteriorate over time. So paper actually does something that's very similar, and paper makers refer to this as paper's memory. So paper, like a landscape, for an example, a mountain, the ridge of a mountain, paper has a capacity to remember the way that it was born, and it has the capacity to retain what happens to it while it lives. So even as it's destroyed, even in its death, it stands as a testament to its demise. And So the qualities and the questions that compel me to make paper are the things that seem to me to be the most fundamentally human. You know, we all have bodies, and this is sort of translated into my relationship with the material itself as a body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when we first talked in the studio, or here, in this space.
In this space.
I spent a long time looking really closely, going up close to the works on the walls, and you start to see all of these little traces of specific objects, and then the folds and creases of fabric that you lay on the paper. And that's where that Aristotle quotation, maybe we should just pull that up.
Oh yeah, I got you. Nope. It's coming up, I promise.
It's a short one.
There we go.
Yeah, I was teaching De Anima, Aristotle's treatise on the soul, and so there's this whole account of memory in that text, and a conception of the soul as a kind of structure that's malleable enough to be imprinted, but also solid enough to not be like water that can't hold on to anything. And it made me think so much about Hong's work, because there's something so precarious and poignant about the way that the paper retains these traces in different depths and in different degrees across the paper. And then thinking about souls and memory, that sort of led both Hong and I to talk a lot about time in relation to her work. And I happened to be reading this John Berger text, called Our Faces, Briefest Photos. But he talks about how historically, for all of humankind, there are two kinds of time. There's the time of consciousness, and there's the time of matter. And we're always subject to both kinds of time. The time of matter is like our biological necessitated time. But the time of consciousness is something elusive and open. And as we were writing, I felt like that double sensibility for time is so strongly present in your work and in your thinking too, and in the paper as a material structure that deals materially with the imprinting of events and actions, but also transcends into that kind of time of consciousness.
Yeah. I think in my email to you, I wrote that there are two kinds of time. There is the external time, which is the time that governs the seasons and, hurries every living thing to its death. And then there's this really private interior experience of time. And that's sort of this ambiguous landscape between the past, the present, and the future, where everything coalesces and exists as one. And papermaking, for me, has been a way to, or maybe an attempt to reconcile these two very different understandings of time, one which is finite and one which is infinite, which takes us back to the poem that was initially read. I think of the actions involved in papermaking as abstract temporal measurements. Papermaking is very ritualistic in that it involves the same sequence of steps every single time the paper is created. And through these same steps, the physical qualities of the material change, but the chemical composition is different. And for me, it's the pacing of making paper is a way for me to understand how time might flow in lieu of a mechanical clock or a calendar. I think, did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's also, in this exhibit, the idea of the dark segment, which maybe you can just explain, for anybody who doesn't know that terminology, but the idea of the time of seasons and the time of light and darkness, which is, of course, not equivalent to clock time, but it's a way of
telling time. Okay, so the dark segment, so at any given moment, half of Earth is covered in darkness, and the shadow moves across the surface of the earth at approximately 1,000 miles an hour. And the dark segment, so the terminator is the divide or the dissolve between night and day. And when we were talking about titles for this exhibition, I'm like, maybe I'll call it the Terminator and it'll be funny. But then I was like, no, I'm not doing that. So then when I was researching about this, about the darkness, the dark segment is actually the name given to the end of that shadow. So it would be that ring of blueness that you would see in the sky right before night descends. So there's an interesting idea of the cyclical nature of time in that every day the day is born and the day dies. So when I pour paper outside, I begin at dawn. And every single large-scale paper pour concludes by dusk. You know, so it's sort of the idea of, again, repetition as a way to punctuate time.
And I mean, you mentioned before how important it is that the papers themselves see the sunrise.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's almost like the birth of the paper coincides with the dawn of the day, mm-hmm. and there's something very important about the imprinting of that luminous memory, which I think, you know, for me, I feel like the color that you're achieving, and not just the color you achieve in the papers in the pour, but the fact that they are subjected to the light outside, that you openly embrace the idea that they fade and that the color will shift over time, that's really related to that kind of nascent moment of being in the sun.
Yeah. I'm not really interested in color as something that conveys emotion. I'm interested in color as a body, as something that's capable of giving something else a body. So in the pieces that you guys see in this exhibition, the colors are not sealed with a mordant. So the idea is that this summer, I'll actually be taking all the pieces outside and letting the sun bleed the color from the paper. So it's the idea that as these fully saturated palettes fade into grayscale, that this transition is the accumulation of light over consecutive summers. There's something interesting about giving a body to that accumulation, mm-hmm. you know.
So, I mean, that goes back a little bit toward the kind of idiosyncratic, really interesting notion of a body as something not just materially a thing, but mm-hmm. in transition, a body in motion or in process. And there were a set of memories that you emailed, or back and forth, a set of memories we were both kind of emailing each other. But one that stood out for me was your memory of walking in another person's footprints in the snow as a child, and then later tracing these lines in the desert mm-hmm. terrain, mm-hmm. And somehow thinking about the way that your choice of paper as material and the pouring of the paper relates to that sensibility of kind of inhabiting a mold mm-hmm. and letting your body become somehow coextensive with another body or the body of the earth or history, memory, bodies being entangled together.
Yeah, when we were writing initially about bodies, I said to Megan, well, I didn't say it to her, I wrote it to her, that more so than bodies, I'm interested in what happens between bodies. So recently, I heard about a story, and there's a philosophical word for it, and it's not very pretty, it's clinamen. So in a time before time in the story, all that existed was this rain of atoms that endlessly fell. And one day, one atom swerved just a little bit from its path and touched another. And because of gravity or these invisible forces that happen between bodies, for some reason they held on to each other. And then more atoms accumulated, and that this was the beginning of above and below, one form and another, as well as heaven and earth. So the relationships that different bodies or different materials or even different time scales have on each other, however momentarily they might coexist, that's important to my work. So the paper is really a photographic still of these unknowable, sometimes instantaneous and sometimes eternal things that occur within any given landscape, right? So the marks that I see on my paper are really considered to be tributaries, or I think of the surface of the paper as the surface of a planet, as something that's carved by time, which is similar to our skin. And I think of every mark as essentially evidence or maybe ruins of something else.
We were saying this new configuration seems really related to the reign of atoms and the idea of atomic swerve. But I mean, hearing you invoke the word gravity, that was something that was really important when I was thinking about writing about your work, because I had this initial experience when I walked into Real Artways and the first iteration of this installation was here, where I felt like I really was sort of upended bodily. Like I couldn't tell, am I looking down on top of something? Am I looking up from below? And as I sort of walked and stayed in the room and felt in the atmosphere of the work, I really felt like there was something that you were doing with gravity, where I was being introduced to gravity as a force that I hadn't actually experienced in that way before. So not as this sort of constant downward pressure that you're not aware of unless you try to jump or you try to resist against it, but a pressure that's coming from all sides. Mm-hmm. And it's something I feel like your work really engages in, and then you emphasize through the turning and rearrangement of the papers, and then this sort of simultaneous real heft of them, which is, I think, surprising. Yeah. Because, of course, they're paper, and all the associations that go along with paper are kind of fighting against the real heftiness of this work. And I think of it as the athleticism of your having made it and arranging it.
Mm-hmm. I think, well, that was a lot. So let me think for a minute. I do think about gravity quite a bit. And like I said, I do think about the connections. When I was arranging this work in a gallery, I would come in at 4 or 5 in the morning and work for 7 or 8 hours before anyone got here. And something that surfaced in this particular body of work that had never occurred to me before was the idea of first contact. Or that moment of initial sort of ecstatic recognition between one object and another, right? Sometimes you don't know where you end and the world begins until you touch something else, and I was thinking a lot about that when I was making the work. And most of this work is made outdoors in different places, so my practice is nomadic. And when I was traveling from state to state between 2015 and up until now, I was thinking of landscape as a flexible surface, much like paper, that's shaped by forces above, below, and around it. And I mentioned this sentence to you in the email, as above, so below. That's a phrase that's used in esoteric astrology and alchemy. And it refers to the idea that Earth is a mirror image of God or the astral plane. So in a more secular context, it can mean that the whole reflects the individual and vice versa. So when I was traveling, obviously I was thinking a lot about the symbolic implications of navigation. And I was thinking a lot about horizontal movement, which manifests itself in the physical realm. So we migrate, dust migrates, everything migrates. And the relationship of that type of movement with vertical ascendance, which to me symbolizes spiritual attainment. So it's I think it's distantly related. It's making sense in my head, but I'm having a hard time conveying it. But it does have to do with all of these different movements and forces coinciding and maybe colliding into one another. And yeah.
Well, and so many of the works figure the complexity of reflection.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm oriented toward this one that's behind many of you, but where you have a sort of repetition of a shape, but it's not a strict repetition.
Yeah.
And I think that lends to that ambiguity in seeing your work of whether it's like looking into a deep pool or looking up into the sky. And those are both sort of natural phenomena where you can have that really destabilizing sense of not knowing quite where you are. Mm-hmm. The deepness and the height are supposedly very distinct, but when you're confronted with them, each is an abyss in their own way.
Yeah.
So let me ask you something about the arriving at dawn.
Yes.
To make this work. So I've asked Hong about this at various junctures because I feel like there's a really amazing performative aspect to this work, both the making of it and all of the ritual and repetition you described, but the installing of it. And I've been able to see you a little bit like pull papers out of a big roll.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it seems like the arranging and installing is a very private endeavor for you.
It is.
I'm curious if you might say something about that, because it seems like both performative and then there's this solitude that seems very central to your practice.
Right. So I think we often think of performance as something that has to occur in front of an audience. At least I think a large portion of performative work that I've experienced has been so. But I think that there's sort of another aspect to performance, for me, that involves ritual. So ritual can mean mundane habits that rise out of convention, or it can be this act of devotion that connects its participant to a higher being. And when I engage in these actions, I guess I'll just talk about what a paper pour feels like for me when I arrive. I arrive in darkness, the light begins to change, and suddenly the world completely recedes, and it only comes to me in the most beautiful of ways. I know beautiful is a word we all scoff at, but it comes to me as changing light, dipping temperatures, familiar sensations, because the work is very much based on this memory of physical sensations that I carry with me, as well as movements. And it is this utter devotion to something. And it's also, it's very sensual. The material itself is very seductive, but it's also this process that unites opposites, right? Because it can be slow or it can be fast. You're essentially making your paint from scratch. So there's a slowness tethered to it. And it's also this kind of dance between surrender and control, and then chaos and repetition. I guess it's my private ritual. It's my way of watching something come into being completely and then also die, because the work is dissolved after a time.
Yeah, and I think, that links up with some of the discussions that we've had about repetition.
Yeah.
And ritual. One of the things I was thinking about in conjunction with your work is a Pina Bausch dance called March of the Seasons, which figures, if you've seen the Wim Wenders Pina Bausch movie, it figures in the very last scene of this movie. This is what is still distill from that. But it's this repetition. There are 4 hand gestures, and there's a line of dancers, and they're all performing the same hand gestures. And you get that, you get that very poignant sort of dislocation that happens with repetition. So what is repeated is never just the same, but in the act of repeating comes back differently, and there's a cumulative effect of the repetition. And that seems to me really linked to your sense of ritual and time, that there's something predetermined about what steps have to be taken. Yes. But there's also this sort of cumulative drift or dephasing, which for me is such an exciting choreographic possibility or musical possibility. But for you, this is sort of the material condition.
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of, I think you really hit it on the head in that the same things are repeated, but at the same time, within these parameters, there's such a wide country, like different ways that it manifests. So in making these compositions, I was actually thinking about if we were to look at our world atomically, then all the differences would dissolve, such as texture, species, whatever it is that may be dividing one thing from another. And I actually think of all of my paper, so at that level, I think the universe becomes this really homogeneous, it has this homogeneous order to it that uses different units, which are repeated to create these infinite manifestations. So when I was making all of these different iterations, the show changed over time, and I really consider that each piece of paper to just be a unit that exists temporarily. And at each exhibition space, I'm sort of pulling out my library, my big rolls of paper, and creating something new. So like the things that seem eternal, like the trees, the rivers, the snow, they come to us, they leave, but then they return. So the idea of making these compositions kind of goes along with the process of making paper in that generative way. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm glancing at the time and wondering, we want to make sure that you have time to ask questions if you have them. So we're at the tip of the iceberg in the things that we can talk about. But I think if anyone has a question that you are that you're dying to pose, we want to make sure we have time for you.
And we have a microphone for you.
Hopefully this will work. I saw a hand. Oh, hey, Rebecca.
I know there's going to be a microphone now. I'm nervous. One thing you haven't talked about is color and how it relates to your philosophy and all of these kind of, rituals, process, all these underpinnings of your work. So I'm really curious, kind of about the brass tacks that you haven't talked about, like color choice, composition. I am also curious how you get these vibrant colors, like what are your dyes? But more importantly, how much physical planning do you do for color and composition? What does that look like, and how does that relate to these bigger things that you're discussing now?
Okay, so that was a lot of questions. Yeah, don't worry, don't apologize. I'll address the different things. So the color is fiber reactive dyes, which is used for cotton, wool, and because the bark is a natural material, it takes on that dye really nicely. I don't dye the paper the right way so that they fade over time, and the goal is to get them to grayscale eventually. That might take a few summers, but I don't mind waiting. There was something else. Oh, the shapes. So when I work, I think of different shapes as characters within a book. So every summer, I have a set of protagonists and antagonists, and they sort of play off of each other. And that's pretty set. And I essentially create these shapes over and over and over again.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
So you mean you'll have like, like the round shape with the jagged edge, that is a character?
It comes from different sentences. Like the circles came from the sentence, God is a circle, its center is everywhere, which is from like an ancient Greek text. I was also thinking about windows. Let's see, where did the other things come from? I don't know. I have a journal with all these things.
Don't tell.
You don't have to reveal anything you don't want to.
No, I mean, in our correspondence, one of the other striking things that you mentioned was this memory of looking out windows, like an early childhood memory. And so we had a little bit of correspondence about how, how those early childhood memories inform your idea about composition and framing, and what was the window and the shape of the window, and was it high or low to the ground, and was it the window moving in a car, the landscape sliding by, or the stillness. So, I think there's a lot of very deep evocative stuff to say about the framing and window-like apertures across your compositions.
Hi, thank both of you. I would like to thank both of you for all of the thoughts that you've brought forth. And I would like to take issue with your thinking that beauty is a word that we don't like to talk about anymore, because I think it's so present in this room. And I think it's great. I mean, I think that one of the reasons that there are so many people here is because of the exquisite beauty of what has emerged from what you're doing. And I think that that's something that I'd like to hear you talk about a little bit more in terms of, well, it comes back to what was asked a moment ago about issues of composition. I mean, you're thinking clearly in terms of some of those traditional ways of putting together a composition that is quite exquisite. So that's one thing I'd like to ask. Another thing that occurs to me is that in these installations, the concept of time, I think, is very, very, it's very charged, because the interiors of these forms seem to speak to the ongoing, potentially infinite time that you've talked about so much, and yet at the same time, the edges that are clipped and cut so precisely from actions of the body, the performative act, seem to speak to a very, very different kind of time, and they play off against one another, and I'm interested in what you might think about that. And then finally, I'm also interested in what appears to me to be, I have a lot of thoughts obviously, but you've provoked a lot, what appears to be the relative stasis of the works as they're in the gallery. I mean, they are here for a certain time, and they will more or less stay that way for the time that they're here, and how that fits into your overall philosophy.
Okay. So you asked me about beauty. What do I think of beauty? It's such a big word, and I think it can encompass so many different forms. I guess one quote that comes immediately to mind for me is Virginia Woolf. In the book A Room of One's Own, she writes, "The beauty of a world so soon to perish has two edges, one of laughter and one of anger, cutting the heart asunder." My friend wrote to me, and he said, he once told me that death was the most beautiful thing of all, and I was quoting him back to him in my email to him, and he said, well, maybe death is not the most beautiful thing, maybe finality just serves to bring forth our appreciation and our memory of beauty within that moment. So when we were talking in our conversation, I talked about dissolving these works. So eventually what's going to happen, the beautiful thing about paper is that once you add water to it, it returns to its own original material, which is the pulp. So the idea is that these sheets of paper would be bleached over time, and once they're black and white, I'll dissolve them in the rainstorm, and in that moment, they cease to be what they once were, but they can be reused to create something else, and they have a chance to continue forward as another form. So it kind of has to do with the idea of reincarnation. But I think for me, the beauty of these works really lives in the process. Like I said, the art object is not so important to me, but it's really moving to me that they, like us, live a life of their own, and that they're born, they exist, and they die. And I I can't really remember your next two questions. I got sidetracked. Time? Oh, the edges. Okay, the relationship between the interiors and the edges? I have never thought about that. So I'm slow, so it takes me some time to come up with an answer to any question. I think in this last iteration, the pieces have started branching out from a more uniform shape, which they were in before. Now there's swerves coming out. There's all these objects cascading from the main body. And it kind of reminds me, I think about landscape a lot as a genre when I'm working. I think about the differences between Eastern and Western landscapes, traditional ones in particular. So in Western landscape, it's really about illusion, right? And it's about the rendering of the landscape. And whereas in traditional Eastern landscapes, it's sort of about an impression or a manifestation of what that landscape might be. So a painter might walk around, drink some wine, look at some mountains, and then go back to his house and whip out some, oh, just kidding. That was apropos. Whip out some ink, which cannot be controlled the way that oil paint can be controlled, right? It's instantaneous, and you can't control the way that the ink flows across the surface. It's like a river. And I'm getting to the point. So in Eastern landscapes, in Chinese landscape painting, the void is just as important as the object. The void is charged, so to speak. And so in this last iteration, I really started thinking about the wall as a void, or as the negative space, or as the landscape in which these pieces live. So when I was making the compositions, I really was thinking about the gallery space as a two-dimensional surface, and how the papers would relate with that. It's obviously not two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional, but how they would relate in that way.
I mean, I think my initial, like when I first walked into this space, I had this kind of, it takes your breath away a little bit, the intensity of light that is generated by the work. And I feel like there's something, that sense of, that what you're describing as the Eastern landscape sensibility for the kind of affect of the landscape rather than the things of the landscape. I feel like that's very present in your work and what it does to us as viewers of it, which is something more than, it's different than seeing something but it is like being in the sunrise or the sunset, like you get that heat or that immediate affect. And just one other thing I was thinking in this question about time is that so much of your process, I think like most artistic process, is about negotiating surrender and control. And one thing that struck me as being so interesting about your work is the way that it kind of captures time, the specific stretch of time between light and darkness. That's kind of the margin of where your focus in the making of the paper is. And so there's something very still and slow about that capturing, but then you're actually accelerating their demise. You're not just sort of leaving them somewhere, but you're going to take them out into the bright sun, and you're going to take them out into a rainstorm. So it's this slowness and stillness, and at the same time, there's this incredible acceleration of their demise. So I think, that's another really interesting part of the tension between them being still on the wall and then knowing as viewers that they have this imminent destiny.
Thank you for this talk. It's been really lovely to think about all of the ways that ideas take form and form takes to ideas in the work. One thing I'm thinking about is the sites. And so we've got this site of the gallery where the ecological action in the work is sort of latent, and we get to imagine what happens as the colors fade, and then as the pulp goes, the paper goes back to pulp. And I'm really curious about how these works might also function in the natural environment for audiences and performativity in terms of the urban environment. I see a lot of connections with these surfaces and surfaces in the urban environment, especially paper and signs, kind of like Mark Bradford's work. But I'm curious at your choice of having the work here in a gallery when a lot of it exists outside, and how you might be playing around with different ways of presenting the work or not. Is it important that it's latent, that those ecological actions are not what's pictured, but that that's imagined?
I still believe in mystery, so I think the absence of something speaks to its presence, perhaps more so than anything else. So the ecological processes that you speak of and the places that these are made, I would like for some of it to be imagined, but I am definitely considering the journey of making paper outside and the architecture of that, because I sort of go to residencies or wherever I can find a studio, but I'm trying to become a lot more intentional about the migration of these pieces in the wild, so to speak. And so I've been toying with, I want to learn how to sustainably harvest from different trees. There's one tree that I'm really interested in called the Tree of Heaven, which is a traditional medicinal tree in Chinese medicine. It's one of the oldest trees that was categorized in the traditional Chinese book, and just sort of relating. So I'm definitely considering how the process of large-scale paper pours can be tethered to the world. Because right now it's sort of, it can feel a little one-dimensional to me in that I'm pouring paper outside, the rain comes, la 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 la. It's an impression, but I think there's another sort of, there's more flavor that can be extracted, but it's really, I don't have an answer to that yet. I'm just sort of thinking about it, ruminating on it at the moment. Yeah.
I mean, I think that question is so interesting, and one of the artists that we were sort of emailing about was Ana Mendieta, a Cuban feminist performance artist, and her earthworks, earth forms, where she's using her body to leave these impressions in the ground. And for me, there's such a strong kind of synchronicity between some of your practice and that work. And so something we didn't talk about in the conversation today was some of the feminist implications of that genre of work and the transformation of labor into artistic practice and the transformation of material into the immaterial. So I think, this sort of ecological question and the question of where the work resides is really tied into that history as well, which is a really rich, interesting history.
I think we have time for about one or two more.
So it seems like you have like a really strong connection with your work and nature. What do you think would be lost most if you were forced to move more indoors?
You mean in the process of making the work or in terms of display?
In making.
Oh, I wouldn't like that. I would resist very firmly. Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, was that a bad answer?
I mean, I think, you can sense there's something really wild about this work. in its scale, in its assembly, in its sensibility. So, I mean, when I was writing about it, I started to have, I felt, you know, I didn't want to sort of make it overly figural or animal-like, but I had this affection for the pieces like wild animals who really don't want to be pinned on these walls, but are kind of temporarily held here. And they want to go outside.
Yeah, I think they do want to go outside.
Okay, one more.
I'm curious about the collaborative process of the paper pours, because in most of the photographs, you're working with a group of people, I assume sometimes students, maybe community members, and I wonder if there's a story of a time when one of those collaborators made a decision or impacted the way that the final paper looked that maybe you wouldn't have come to on your own.
So my practice is divided between two different avenues. I'm mostly very private when I make work, and then I also do collaborative paper pours when I teach. I love teaching papermaking outdoors in the summer. It's a great equalizer. It's democratic in that we all have memories of touching paper, but it's this magical sort of unknown process. And it helps us to understand how our world is constructed. You know, it's very tangible in that way. So in most of the images, I'm actually teaching a workshop, but I'm not really teaching because we're just coming together with our hands and arms, and we're doing whatever our bodies feel like doing at that moment, you know, and it's very liberating. So in terms of these works, no, because the work that I show, I tend to plan very extensively, and I really love being alone. But there's also something really joyful and wonderful about being able to be with people and to commune around, I guess, a big wooden box in the summertime. So that's really all I have to say about that, yeah.
All right, I think that's good for today. I'm just gonna saunter on up. Again, thank you all so very, very much for coming by. We have some refreshments and snacks out there. Hong and Megan will still be here if you have some more questions and follow up. They're clearly wonderful people to talk to, so I think it's okay to talk to them. And again, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Megan, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.